13 of the deadliest snipers on the planet lined up. 13 trigger pulls. 13 misses. The target sat 4,000 meters out. Nearly 2.5 miles of desert heat, shifting wind, and terrain designed to break men who had never been broken before. Delta operators. SEAL snipers. Rangers who'd buried friends and kept shooting. Every single one of them walked away. Then a woman nobody recognized stepped up to the firing line. Small, quiet, no combat patch anyone could place. She didn't touch the rifle first. She took off her boots. If you've never heard the name Mara Vane, you're about to understand why that's exactly how she wanted it. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story to the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert didn't care who you were. That was the first thing Master Chief Rowan Hale told every student who ever came through his program. Not the first day of instruction, not during the safety brief, not in some motivational speech at the end of a long week. He said it the moment they arrived, before they'd unloaded their gear, before they'd had water, standing in the blast furnace heat of the Nevada high desert, with the sun sitting straight overhead like God had aimed it at them personally. The desert doesn't know your rank. It doesn't know your record. It doesn't give a damn what you did in Fallujah or Kandahar or whatever classified hellhole you came from. Out here, all that matters is whether you're paying attention. Hale had retired from active service 14 months ago. He still wore his hair military short, still walked like he was crossing a phobie under indirect fire, still had the habit of scanning a room's exits before he'd sit down anywhere. Some things didn't wash out. The Marine Corps had spent 26 years putting them in, and no amount of civilian life was going to dissolve them. He stood now at the Observer's Ridge at Raven Rock Desert Range, 60 miles southeast of Reno, and watched the convoy of black SUVs roll through the gate below in a trail of pale dust. 13 vehicles, one for each shooter. The Joint Precision Marksmanship Assessment, JPMA, ran every 2 years, unofficial, invitation only, no press, no public record, no unit citations. 13 slots issued across the Special Operations community, 3 from Naval Special Warfare, 3 from the Army's Combat Applications Group, 2 from Marine Force Recon, 2 from Air Force Special Tactics, and 3 wildcards drawn from classified programs most people in the DoD didn't know existed. The stated purpose was interbranch skills evaluation. The real purpose, the one everyone understood but nobody said out loud, was to find out who was actually the best. Not the best on paper, the best when conditions were impossible. This year's challenge was already earning a reputation before anyone had fired a shot. The targeting board had spent 6 weeks designing the course of fire, and when they'd briefed the parameters to the range cadre, 2 of the range officers had quietly requested reassignment, not because they were cowards, because they understood what they were looking at. 4,200 meters. In summer, with full thermal inversion. The steel target was a standard IPSC silhouette, roughly the dimensions of a human torso, bolted to a steel frame anchored in a rocky depression at the base of the canyon's far wall. Getting a bullet there wasn't impossible in a vacuum. Under laboratory conditions, with perfect atmospheric data, a skilled shooter using the right platform could put rounds on steel at that distance with reasonable consistency. Long-range shooting had evolved dramatically in the past decade. The equipment was extraordinary. The ammunition was engineered to tolerances that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. But the desert wasn't a laboratory. The desert was a living, shifting, hostile organism, and on a July afternoon in the Nevada High Basin, it was doing everything in its power to make the physics of a 4,200-meter shot mathematically unrepeatable. Hale had spent 2 days on the ridge before the assessment began, just watching, taking notes. He didn't need a notebook. He'd been doing this long enough that he read terrain the way other men read faces. But he wrote it down anyway because old habits were how you stayed alive. What he recorded wasn't reassuring. The thermal layer over the desert floor was severe and inconsistent, creating refraction effects that made distant objects appear to shift position even through a high magnification optic. The valley that separated the firing line from the target was a wind tunnel, but an irregular one, split by rock formations that created competing currents at different altitudes and speeds. What registered on his wind indicator at the firing position bore almost no relationship to the actual crosswind at the midpoint, and the midpoint wind bore almost no relationship to what was happening in the last 800 meters before the target. 3 different wind environments, all of them changing on cycles that didn't align. Somebody's going to get humiliated today, Hale had thought. Possibly everybody. He hadn't said that to anyone. He'd just watched and waited. The first shooter to step to the line was Petty Officer First Class Darren Coyle, SEAL Team 7, Nies Bois, 28 years old, ranked 4th in Naval Special Warfare for long-range marksmanship. He'd made a 3,400-meter confirmed shot in Syria 2 years prior, which had briefly circulated in certain channels as one of the longest confirmed kills in the theater. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been very good at a difficult thing for a long time and knew it without needing to say so. He spent 40 minutes behind his spotting scope before he touched the rifle. Hale watched from the ridge as Coyle's spotter, a senior enlisted man named Briggs, talked him through the wind reads, calling numbers in the clipped, economical shorthand that long-range teams used. Hale couldn't hear the communication at this distance, but he could read the body language. Coyle was meticulous, professional, building a firing solution from the data available to him with the same systematic approach that had worked for him at shorter distances, in less brutal conditions. The rifle was a custom-built platform chambered in .375 Chaytak, resting in a precision bipod on a concrete shooting bench that the range had constructed exactly at the measured firing point. The scope was a top-tier variable power unit dialed to maximum magnification. Everything that money and engineering and years of refinement could provide was present on that firing line. Coyle settled, stilled, pulled. The muzzle blast rolled across the ridge, and Hale was already watching the impact zone through his own glass when the round arrived. It hit the canyon wall roughly 4 feet to the right and 6 inches low of the target. Coyle didn't react visibly. He rechambered, consulted with Briggs, made adjustments, fired again, 3 feet left, 2 feet high. He fired 4 times in total before stepping back and passing the position to the next shooter. His expression was controlled, but Hale had known enough operators to read what was underneath it. Coyle wasn't confused. He was unsettled. He'd done everything correctly, and it hadn't worked, and he was a man who needed the math to behave. The second shooter was Army. Staff Sergeant Calvin Merritt, Combat Applications Group, Delta, in plain language. Hale had pulled Merritt's file months ago when the assessment roster was first leaked to him through channels. Merritt had 9 confirmed long-range kills, 2 of them at distances over 2,000 meters, one during an operation in northern Mali that Hale was specifically not supposed to know about. The man was exceptional. He was also 34, which in long-range sniper terms meant he was at the peak of the experience to physical capability ratio. Old enough to have learned everything, young enough that his eyes and hands still cooperated. Merritt missed on his first shot. Adjusted. Missed again. His third shot was close enough that the impact debris kicked up on the right edge of the target's base. But the scoring protocol was unambiguous. A hit was a hit. Everything else was a miss. Merritt made one more attempt, walked away without speaking. By the time the 5th shooter had failed, something had shifted in the atmosphere at the range that had nothing to do with the thermal inversion. The men who were waiting their turns had gone quiet. Not the quiet of concentration, they'd all had that coming in, that focused-in professional stillness that elite operators carried as a default state. This was a different quiet. The quiet of people who were recalculating something they'd believed to be settled. Hale leaned against the rail at the observer's ridge and pulled out his water bottle. Beside him, Commander Elias Voss, the JPMA's supervising officer, a lean Navy commander with steel-gray hair and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking at things far away, stood with his arms crossed, watching the firing line below. "You want to give me your read?" Voss said. He didn't look at Hale when he asked it. He was watching the 6th shooter set up. "Same read I gave you before it started," Hale said. "Which was?" "That the wind data at the firing position is a liar." Hale took a drink. "The valley creates 3 distinct wind environments between here and the target. The midpoint current is running roughly 40 degrees different from what the Kestrel is showing at the bench. And the terminal environment, the last 600-700 meters before impact, is a full reversal. The heat coming off that south-facing wall is generating an updraft that's pushing back toward the shooter." Voss was quiet for a moment. "That's a known factor. The shooters all have access to the same meteorological data. The meteorological data is wrong. Another silence. Then how does someone hit it? Voss asked. Hale didn't answer right away. He was watching the six-shooter, Marine Force Recon, a thick-shouldered gunnery sergeant named Olvera, who had the reputation of being the most technically proficient marksman in the entire USMC, settle behind the rifle with the absolute stillness of a man who had trained this exact motion 10,000 times. They stop trusting the data, Hale said finally, and they start reading the desert. Olvera fired. The sun climbed. The heat got worse. By the time the ninth shooter had walked away from the line without a hit, the range had developed the particular atmosphere of a place where something has gone badly and publicly wrong, and everyone present is pretending to still be professional about it. The range cadre moved between positions without making eye contact. The shooters who had already fired stood in small clusters, speaking quietly, running numbers on tablets and phones, trying to find the error in their calculations. There was no error. That was the problem. The calculations were correct. The desert was simply refusing to behave like the calculations predicted. Captain Adrian Cross watched from 30 yards back with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular expression of a man who was angry but couldn't identify a specific target for the anger. Cross commanded a specialized long-range interdiction element attached to a joint task force Hale didn't have clearance to know the full name of. His two shooters from that element had already gone through the line, first and third in the order, and both had missed. Cross had said very little since then, but the silence had a texture to it. "Where's Voss?" Cross said, to no one in particular. A junior range officer nearby shifted his weight. "Observer's Ridge, sir, with Chief Hale." "Hale." Cross said the name like he was identifying something he'd stepped on. "What's Hale doing here? He's retired." "He's a senior assessor, sir. Consulting role." Cross made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went back to watching the 10th shooter miss. The 13th slot on the roster was unusual. Hale had known about it for 3 weeks. He'd been the one to advocate for it, quietly, through the back channels available to a retired Master Chief who had spent 26 years building favors. And even he hadn't been entirely certain the argument would hold until Voss had confirmed the slot 6 days before the assessment. The 13th shooter was not from a named unit. Her file was flagged with a classification level that most of the other shooters at this range did not have access to, which was unusual in itself. JPMA participants were typically senior operators with broad clearances. What little background was visible through her official profile listed her as a Navy Chief Petty Officer currently assigned to a technical research and development program. There were no confirmed kills in her record, no combat deployments in the traditional sense. The marksmanship qualifications listed were extraordinary by any standard, but they were all range qualifications, controlled environment scores that meant something and also didn't mean enough, in the view of most of the men who would be watching. Her name was Mara Vane. Hale had first met her 3 years prior, during a program he still wasn't permitted to name, in a context he described to people who asked, which was almost no one, as advanced human performance research. What he'd seen in that program had been difficult to categorize using the frameworks that conventional military assessment used. Vane was not remarkable by the metrics that typically identified remarkable operators. She was 31 years old, 5'4", 140 pounds, with the kind of unremarkable physical presence that people consistently failed to remember. Her range scores at the conventional distances were excellent, but not exceptional. In a room full of elite snipers, she would not have been the person anyone pointed to first. What she had, what Hale had watched develop over 2 years of observation, was something that didn't have a clean military term. The closest he'd come was environmental cognition, the ability to read a physical environment not as a set of data points to be processed and acted upon, but as a living system with its own internal logic, its own rhythms, its own patterns that revealed themselves if you were patient enough and quiet enough and willing enough to actually stop and listen. Most operators learn to manage environments, to impose their will on the variables and push through. Vane learned environments, like a language, like a personality. He'd watched her do it in a forest in Oregon, in a coastal environment in Virginia, in a high-altitude alpine setting in Colorado. Every time the result was the same. Other shooters applied their skills to the environment and hit their limits. Vane became part of it somehow, and then did things that the other shooters stood around afterward and argued about because the math didn't fully explain them. He thought she could make this shot. He wasn't certain, but he thought so. Cham. Voss called the 13th position when the 12th shooter, Air Force Special Tactics, a young staff sergeant named Duran, who moved like a dancer and had a touch on a trigger that Hale privately thought was the best raw technique he'd seen in 5 years, walked away from the line shaking his head, his face expressionless in the way that only meant something if you knew how to read it. "Final shooter," Voss announced over the range net. "Chief Petty Officer Mara Vane." The reaction at the range was not loud. Elite operators were too disciplined for catcalls or laughter, mostly. What happened was quieter and more corrosive. A shuffling of bodies, a series of exchanged glances, a particular stillness that descended on the clusters of men who had already fired as they processed the name and the insignia and the physical reality of the woman walking toward the firing line and arrived, collectively, at an assessment. She didn't belong here. Hale heard it without anyone saying it. 26 years had calibrated him to that frequency. Cross said something to the officer beside him, too quiet for Hale to catch from his position on the ridge. The officer beside Cross almost smiled, then didn't, then looked back at the firing line. Mara Vane walked to the line like she was walking to a workbench. No ceremony, no performance. She was wearing standard-issue desert utilities, no special kit, nothing customized. She carried a personal notebook, small, battered, the kind that cost $2 at any gas station, in her left hand. Her hair was back and under a cap. She was not wearing sunglasses despite the brutal overhead light, which several of the observers found strange and then forgot about. She set the notebook on the bench beside the rifle. She did not look through the scope. She did not touch the rifle. She stood at the firing position and looked out at the desert with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving slowly across the terrain between the firing line and the target. "What is she doing?" someone said, behind Hale. One of the range cadre, Junior. "Watching," Hale said. "Watching what?" "Everything." The minutes stretched, the sun pressed down. Somewhere at the range perimeter, a vehicle engine turned over and then went quiet. The wind moved through the valley below in one of its irregular pulses, lifting a thin curtain of grit off the desert floor and carrying it sideways before dropping it again. Mara's head moved slightly to track it. She opened her notebook, made a mark, closed it. Cross had moved up from his original position. He was standing closer to the firing line now, arms still crossed, and the expression on his face had shifted from contempt to something that might have been puzzlement if puzzlement weren't beneath him. "She hasn't touched the rifle," he said, to Hale's left. He wasn't addressing Hale directly. He was addressing the general vicinity. Assessment protocols give each shooter a maximum of 60 minutes on the line. She's already burned 20 of them standing there. "She knows the protocol," Hale said. Cross looked at him. "You know her." "I've worked with her." "In what capacity?" "Classified." The expression on Cross's face did something complicated. He was a man who was accustomed to having access to things that were classified, which meant that being told something was classified was also a form of information. He looked back at the firing line, where Mara had crouched down and pressed one palm flat against the desert floor. "She's not going to hit it," Cross said. Quiet, certain, the way a man states a fact he's not invested in, just naming a reality. "Maybe not," Hale said. 13 shooters couldn't make this shot. 13 of the best precision riflemen in the American military. Whatever program you pulled her from, it didn't prepare her for this. "What makes you say that?" "Because nothing prepared anyone for this." Cross gestured at the line with a short, controlled movement. "That's the point. The shot isn't makeable today. Conditions are outside human capacity to compensate for. The value of the assessment isn't the shot, it's the data. We learned something from every miss." Hale said nothing. He was watching Mara, who had stood back up and was now studying the movement of heat waves rising from a rock formation roughly halfway between the firing line and the canyon wall. "What did she do in that program?" Cross asked. "She solved problems that other people had decided couldn't be solved," Hale said. Silence. "By doing what?" Hale looked at him. "By paying attention, yeah." At the 35-minute mark, Mara Vane took off her boots. She set them neatly to the right of the firing bench, her socks folded inside them, with the care of someone who expected to put them back on. Then she stood in bare feet on the desert floor and closed her eyes. The range went very quiet. Even the range cadre, who had seen most things, stopped their quiet conversations and watched. Standing barefoot on burning ground in the middle of a live fire assessment was not something that appeared in any training manual. It was not tactical. It was not rational by any framework that the men watching were using to evaluate what they were seeing. Several of them looked at each other with expressions that ranged from disbelief to amusement to a particular blank look that meant, "I don't know what I'm looking at." Cross made a sound. Not a word. The kind of sound that stood in for a word. Hale watched Mara's face. She wasn't performing. That was the first thing, and the most important thing, to understand about what was happening. There was no audience awareness in her body language, no consciousness of the 30-odd men watching her stand barefoot in the desert. She had simply removed a barrier between herself and the information she needed, with the same pragmatic directness that a mechanic uses when they need to feel for a vibration that they can't hear. The ground was hot, well above 110 degrees at the surface. She was standing on it, and her face showed the discomfort, a slight tightening around the eyes, a small adjustment of her weight. But she didn't move her feet. She was parsing the sensation, separating the information from the noise. Her eyes opened. She looked southwest, then north, then back to the canyon wall. She made 2 more marks in the notebook. Then she picked up the rifle. It was the same platform every shooter had used, a range-issue CheyTac, consistent across all 13 positions to eliminate equipment variables. She checked the chamber, checked the bolt, verified the scope settings with a series of quick, practiced movements that were entirely unremarkable. The hands of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Nothing special in the mechanics. What happened next was where things stopped being mechanical. She settled behind the rifle, and then she went still in a way that was different from the stillness of the previous 13 shooters. They had gone still in the way of focused men, concentrated, processing, internal. Her stillness was external. She wasn't going inward, she was going out, into the air, into the light, into the sound of the wind cycling through the valley below. Her breathing slowed to something almost not there. The crosshairs, if Hale had been able to see them, would have been resting on empty air to the left and low of the target, a hold that would have looked wrong to anyone calculating from the standard wind data. She didn't fire. Another minute passed. Then another. Cross checked his watch with a small, deliberate movement that was its own kind of commentary. The wind pulsed through the valley. A different pulse than before. Faster, tighter. Mara's right hand adjusted on the stock, a movement of maybe a quarter of an inch that Hale caught only because he was watching for it. She fired. The muzzle blast rolled across the ridge, the brass ejected. Mara held her position behind the scope, watching the impact. 8 seconds of silence. Then the spotter, a range cadre sergeant named Polk, who had been assigned to observe and record all 13 shooters, called the impact through his spotting scope in the flat, informational voice of someone doing their job. "Impact," Polk said. "Right edge, low by..." A pause. "Low by 2 feet, right by 8 inches." Hale exhaled slowly through his nose. Not a hit, but not nothing. At 4,200 meters, in these conditions, striking the target's mounting frame rather than blank canyon wall was information. It was a precisely aimed near miss from a shooter who appeared, to the men watching, to have just fired almost blind. Mara didn't move from behind the scope. She was watching the impact point, watching the dust settle, watching the light. She wrote in the notebook, 3 quick marks. Cross leaned toward his adjacent officer. "First shot data," he said, voice careful now in a way it hadn't been before. "She's using the first shot to solve the terminal wind." His officer looked at him. "That's..." The officer stopped. "It's a live sensor," Cross said quietly. "She put a bullet in the air to read the environment at the target end because the Kestrel data is too corrupted to trust." He didn't sound contemptuous anymore. He sounded like a man who has just encountered an idea he hasn't had before and is not certain how he feels about it. Mara rechambered. She held behind the rifle for 93 seconds, Hale counted, before she fired again. The muzzle blast. The 8-second transit. The wait. "Impact," Polk said. His voice had changed slightly. Not dramatic, but different. "Center mass." Nobody spoke. "Confirm," Voss said from Hale's left. "Confirmed hit, sir. Center mass of the IPSC silhouette. 4,217 meters." The silence at Raven Rock Desert Range was the loudest thing Hale had heard in a long time. Mara Vane was still behind the rifle, still looking through the scope at the target she'd just hit. Her breathing, from where Hale stood, appeared to be the same as it had been before she fired. Slow, even, occupying no more space than necessary. She didn't raise a fist. She didn't turn around. She stayed exactly where she was for 11 more seconds, watching the canyon wall, watching the light on the steel, watching whatever it was she was always watching. Then she set the rifle down, picked up her notebook, sat down on the shooting bench, and began putting her boots back on. Nobody moved. 30 meters behind the firing line, Captain Adrian Cross stood with his arms no longer crossed, his hands loose at his sides, his expression doing something that it very clearly did not want to do and was doing anyway. He stared at this woman tying her bootlaces on a firing bench in the Nevada desert, and for the first time since Hale had known him, Adrian Cross had nothing to say. The scoring sergeant's voice was still hanging in the air. Confirmed hit, center mass, when the range erupted. Not in cheers. That wasn't what happened, and anyone who described it that way afterward was softening it into something more comfortable than the truth. What happened was more like a pressure release, the kind of sound a room makes when everyone in it has been holding something tight for a long time, and the grip suddenly fails all at once. There were voices, yes, but they were tangled and confused, men turning to other men with expressions that asked a question nobody wanted to be the first to phrase out loud. The range cadre moved. Polk said something into his radio that Hale couldn't catch. Two of the shooters who'd already fired pushed forward toward the firing line, as if proximity to the bench would help them understand what they'd just witnessed. Mara finished tying her second boot. She stood, tucked the notebook into her left breast pocket, and turned around to find 30-odd people staring at her with the particular blankness of individuals whose mental models have just been revised without their consent. She looked at Hale. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. That was the entirety of their celebration. Voss was already moving down from the observer's ridge, his stride carrying the controlled urgency of a man who understands that the next 15 minutes will require careful management. He reached the firing line and stood in front of Mara with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the expression of a commander who is processing something unexpected and doing it in public. "Chief Petty Officer Vane," Voss said. "Sir? Walk me through your solution." Mara looked at him for a moment, not hesitating, considering how to compress something complicated into language that would be useful in this context. The MET data at the firing position was reading a left-to-right crosswind at 9 miles per hour, she said. But the valley floor was showing contradictory information. Sand movement in the first 1,000 meters was consistent with a surface-level reversal, wind actually moving right to left at lower velocity. The two readings cancel out in the standard calculation, which is why everyone's adjustments weren't holding. Voss waited. "The mid-valley wind environment is split by that rock formation at the 1,600-meter mark," she continued. "It creates a Venturi effect, acceleration through the gap, direction shift on the exit side. I needed terminal data to confirm the behavior in the last segment, which is what the first shot gave me." "You deliberately missed with the first shot." "I deliberately gathered information with the first shot, sir. The result was a near miss. Those aren't the same thing." Voss was quiet for a moment. Behind him, several of the shooters had closed to within earshot, and Hale could see them processing the explanation with expressions ranging from grudging acknowledgement to something more resistant. "The ground temperature reading," Voss said. "Your feet. The thermal differential between the surface and the air column affects updraft velocity off the south-facing canyon wall. I needed a direct read, not an instrument read. The instruments were calibrated for standard desert conditions. Today wasn't standard." Voss looked at her for 3 full seconds. Hale had known Elias Voss for 11 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he'd seen the man actually surprised. This was one of them. "Unorthodox," Voss said finally. "Yes, sir." "Effective." "That's what I was going for." Something almost moved in Voss's face. He turned away and began speaking quietly to the senior range officer, leaving Mara standing at the bench with the attention of every man at the range pressing against her from all sides. Cross hadn't moved. He was still in the position he'd occupied when Polk made the call. 12 feet back from the firing line, arms now loose at his sides rather than crossed. The physical language of a man whose default posture has been disrupted. I was watching Mara with an expression that had shed the contempt somewhere in the last 4 minutes and replaced it with something Hale couldn't immediately categorize. Not respect. Not yet. Something more cautious than respect. the expression of someone who has revised one assessment and isn't yet ready to commit to a new one. Mara saw him looking. She didn't look away. She didn't extend anything. No acknowledgement, no challenge. She just met his eyes briefly with the flat, neutral attention of someone noting a variable, and then moved her gaze to something else. Cross walked over to Hale. "The first shot is a diagnostic tool," he said, low enough that it was between them. "That's not in any training doctrine I've seen." "No," Hale agreed. "Where did she develop it?" "Extended observation under field conditions. A lot of different environments. A lot of time paying attention to things that other people were walking past." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I can give you." Cross looked at him with the particular frustration of a man who is accustomed to having access and is encountering its limits. He looked back at Mara, who had moved away from the bench and was standing near the range perimeter, facing the valley, notebook open again. "She's still working," Cross said. "She's always working," Hale said. Well, the debrief convened 90 minutes later in the range's primary briefing facility, a prefabricated building with the aesthetic charm of a storage unit that had been given chairs and a projector. 13 shooters, the range cadre, Voss at the front of the room, Hale at the back. Mara sat in the second row, third seat from the left, her notebook on the table in front of her, closed. The format was standard JPMA protocol. Each shooter presented their firing solution, their observed outcomes, and their assessment of where the solution had broken down. The stated purpose was institutional learning. The actual atmosphere in the room was something that shared several characteristics with a post-mortem. Darren Coyle went first. He was precise and unhurried, walking through his calculation with the professional clarity of a man who has made peace with a result he doesn't like. His solution had been correct by every standard computational model. The shot had missed by 4 feet. He said so without qualification. The meteorological data was insufficient to model the actual atmospheric conditions, he said. The wind at the firing position was not representative of the downrange environment. Without better sensor placement at multiple points along the flight path, a reliable firing solution wasn't achievable through conventional means. Voss nodded, made a note. Calvin Merritt followed. His assessment was shorter and carried more controlled irritation in its undertones. Same conclusion, the data environment didn't support the shot. The shot wasn't makeable with available information. Around the room, variations on this theme repeated themselves. The vocabulary changed. Different units used different terminology, and the Delta operators tended toward more technical language than the Navy men, and the Air Force ST Sergeant Duran expressed things in a style that was almost formal in its precision. But the core assessment was consistent. Impossible conditions, insufficient data, shot wasn't makeable. When it came around to Mara, the room had developed a particular texture. She opened her notebook, looked down at it for a moment. "My solution was built in 2 phases, she said. Her voice was even, pitched to carry without effort, no performance in it. Phase 1 was environmental observation, approximately 35 minutes of passive data collection before I touched the rifle. What I was looking for were the behavioral patterns that the instruments couldn't capture. Wind cycle regularity, thermal differential gradient, secondary current indicators in the terrain. That phase gave me a partial solution." She paused, looked up. Phase 2 was active sensing. The first shot was a calibrated probe into the terminal environment. The impact data confirmed the reversal current in the final segment and gave me the actual deflection coefficient I needed to complete the solution. Silence in the room. Petty Officer Coyle turned his pen over in his fingers once. "You're describing a methodology that requires 2 shots, he said. Not aggressive, professional. In an operational context, a 2-shot engagement at that distance takes a minimum of 12 to 16 seconds. That's a significant exposure window. In a stationary target, fixed position scenario, yes, Mara said, that's a real limitation. In a real engagement, your target is moving, or your target has protection, or your target has heard the first shot. All true. So the methodology doesn't translate to operational use. The specific implementation doesn't, Mara said. The underlying principle does. Learning the environment before you commit to a solution that translates everywhere. The 2-shot structure was specific to these conditions. The observation discipline isn't. Coyle considered this. He didn't look satisfied exactly, but he didn't push further. Cross spoke from 2 rows back. The observation phase, he said. 35 minutes. In an operational scenario, you'd have a target window measured in seconds or minutes. How do you compress that? You don't always, Mara said. Sometimes the answer is that you've been in position long enough, in the environment long enough, that the observation is already done before the window opens. That's a preparation question, not a real-time question. And if you don't have that preparation time, then you're doing something else. You're not doing this. Cross looked at her steadily. That sounds like a theoretical framework that works perfectly in theoretical conditions. So does any other targeting doctrine, if you pick the right counterexample. The room went quiet in the specific way of a space where something has been said that people are deciding whether to react to. Cross's jaw moved slightly. She's not wrong, Coyle said, from the front row. He didn't look at Cross when he said it. He was looking at his notebook, and his voice was the carefully neutral voice of someone calling a fact a fact. Every targeting doctrine has boundary conditions where it breaks down. She's not claiming hers doesn't. Cross said nothing. Hale, at the back of the room, watched Cross's hands. They were flat on the table, very still. The stillness of deliberate control. Voss moved the debrief forward. The rest of the session covered technical data, flight time measurements, observed wind indicators that had been recorded by range sensors for post-event analysis, suggestions for improving the Met data collection system for future assessments. Professional. Useful. The kind of institutional work that made programs better over time. Mara participated without excess. She answered what was asked of her, added detail where it was relevant, and did not volunteer anything that wasn't useful to the discussion. But Hale noticed that two of the shooters, Coyle and Merritt, separately, at different points in the session, had their notebooks open and were writing things down while she spoke. Not their own notes. Hers. The exact phrasing of what she'd said. He noticed that Cross did not write anything. The range facility had a small commissary set, military-grade functional, no ambiance whatsoever, but the coffee was adequate and there were enough tables to seat 30 people without crowding. After the debrief broke, most of the assessment participants filtered through it in the particular post-event drift of people who have finished something intense and aren't yet ready to transition to whatever comes next. Mara was sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking and her notebook open to a new page. She was writing something, and from Hale's angle it was impossible to tell whether it was assessment notes or something else entirely. He got his own coffee and sat across from her without asking, which was the dynamic they'd established 3 years ago and had never renegotiated. She looked up briefly, looked back down. Cross is going to be a problem, she said. Probably. He's the type who needs to be right more than he needs to understand what happened. The two things are going in different directions for him right now. Hale wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He'll calibrate. Or he won't, and he'll find a way to make the assessment mean something different than what it means. She wrote something. Does he have influence over the program? Some. Not direct authority, but indirect. He knows people. She looked up at him then, and the look had something in it that wasn't quite worry, but was in the same neighborhood. The particular expression of someone who has learned to anticipate institutional friction the way others learn to anticipate weather. You knew this shot would create problems, she said. It wasn't an accusation. I knew it would create information, Hale said. What people do with information is their choice. That's a very diplomatic answer for a man who spent a career in an organization that doesn't do diplomacy. I spent a career in an organization that does structured conflict. It's different. She almost smiled. Not quite. The commissary door opened and Duran came in. The Air Force ST sergeant, the last shooter before Mara, the one who'd come closest before her. He was young, 26 or 27, with the built-in precision of someone who had been doing difficult things with his hands since he was a teenager. He went to the coffee station, filled a cup, and then with the directness of someone who has decided not to overthink something, he walked to their table and sat down in the third chair without being invited. I've been thinking about the first shot, he said. Mara looked at him. I want to understand the hold, he said. You were holding left and low of the target on both shots. The second one hit center mass. So the actual hold point was, what, roughly 2 body widths left and 3 feet low? Approximately. That's a significant departure from what the Kestrel data would suggest. Yes. What was the primary driver of the left hold? The Venturi effect you mentioned in the debrief? Mara looked at him for a moment. Hale watched her decide something. The Venturi effect accounted for about 60% of it, she said. The rest was terminal updraft deflection. The heat column coming off the canyon wall was pushing the bullet right in the final segment, which reads in the scope as the target being left of its actual position. You compensate by holding further left than the standard wind correction would suggest. Duran wrote something on a folded piece of paper he'd pulled from his pocket. And the low hold? The updraft also has a vertical component. It was lifting the bullet in the terminal segment. I was holding low to let the updraft carry the round up into the target zone. He wrote more. His handwriting was precise, small, even letters, the writing of someone who took notes seriously. I was holding right and high, he said, without looking up, which means every correction I made was working against me. I was fighting the conditions I should have been using. Yes, Mara said. He finished writing, looked up. He had the kind of direct gaze that came from a lot of time looking through precision optics, steady, without aggression, just focused. How long did it take you to develop this approach? He said. Develop is probably the wrong word. It wasn't a deliberate process. I started paying attention to environments differently after a certain point. It built over time. After what point? She was quiet for a moment. After a situation where the numbers were right and people died anyway, she said. The commissary held that for a second. Duran nodded once, slowly. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. Thank you, he said. He stood, picked up his coffee, and walked away to a table on the other side of the room. Hale waited. You're going to get questioned like that from a lot of people in the next few days, he said. I know. How do you want to handle it? Honestly, she picked up her coffee finally, found it cold, drank it anyway. It's not complicated. It's just uncomfortable for people who've built their identity around a specific approach. Cross isn't going to come ask you questions like Duran did. No, she agreed. Cross is going to go find someone he outranks and have a different kind of conversation. The conversation Cross had was not with someone he outranked. It was with two men of roughly equivalent authority. A Marine colonel named Stearns, who ran Force Recon's training pipeline, and an Army lieutenant colonel named Abernathy, who worked in a capacity that Hale understood to be adjacent to the Combat Applications Group's selection and assessment function without being directly inside it. The three of them occupied a table near the commissary's back wall with the body language of men who have chosen their position carefully, which was a thing men at that level did automatically and often without realizing it. Hale didn't join them. He wasn't invited, and the dynamic between himself and Cross had been established clearly enough that an uninvited approach would produce more friction than information. Instead, he sat with Mara until she finished her cold coffee and then walked with her out to the range's vehicle staging area, where the afternoon heat had not diminished by a single degree. Stearns and Abernathy, Hale said when they were outside. Mara glanced at him. Cross is talking to them now. Inside. She processed this without visible reaction. Program review? You? Possibly. Or just narrative management, making sure the story of what happened today is the story that serves them. She was quiet for a moment. They were walking slowly along the perimeter fence, no particular destination, and the desert stretched out beyond the wire in all directions with the indifferent immensity it always had at this hour, the light going amber and long across the rock. What story would serve them? She said. Anomaly, Hale said. Lucky Red. Conditions happen to align with an unconventional approach, which doesn't generalize, and the program's existing methodology remains sound and doesn't need revisiting. That's not what happened. I know. The conditions didn't align with my approach. My approach adapted to the conditions. That's the entire point. I know that too. She stopped walking, stood with her arms at her sides looking out through the fence at the desert, and Hale saw in her posture something he hadn't seen much from her in 3 years, the particular tiredness of someone who has done a very hard thing correctly and is now realizing that the hard thing was only the beginning. They're going to try to explain it away, she said. Some of them. And if they manage that, then the shot means less than it should. Hale looked at her. That's why the documentation matters. Voss's report will be the official record. If his assessment reflects what actually happened today, the narrative has a harder time sticking. Does Voss understand what actually happened? I think so. He's a careful man. He'll look at the sensor data, he'll look at the two-shot sequence, he'll read Polk's log. The evidence is there if he's willing to read it straight. Mara turned away from the fence. And if he's not? Hale didn't answer immediately. The light was doing something particular to the desert at this hour, pulling color out of the rock in shades of copper and rust that didn't exist at any other time of day. And he watched it for a moment before he spoke. Then we figure out what comes next, he said. Same as always. She looked at him. Something passed across her face. Not gratitude exactly, but the acknowledgement of a person who has operated alone for long enough that the presence of someone in their corner registers as genuinely significant rather than expected. You should know, she said, that Cross asked someone about my file after the debrief. Hale went still. How do you know that? Duran mentioned it, not directly. He said something about Cross asking the range CO whether the 13th slot had documentation attached, whether there was a unit of record. There is. It's flagged. Cross knows what a flagged file means. He's going to pull the thread. He won't get far. He might get far enough. She met his eyes. If he finds out where I came from before the R&D assignment, this gets more complicated. Not for me. I don't care about complicated, but for the program, for whatever comes after this. Hale was quiet. The desert held them both for a moment. The truth of what she was saying was not subtle. Her background, the operational history that existed in the classified segments of her record, the specific program and specific context in which her skills had been developed, was not a clean story. It was not the kind of record that made institutional conversations easier. There were people who knew pieces of it and had decided, at the time, that the pieces were more valuable inside a classified compartment than outside one. If Cross started pulling at the documentation with enough persistence and enough access, some of those pieces could move, and the people who had put them in the compartment in the first place might have opinions about that. Let me make a call tonight, Hale said. To who? He didn't answer that. She looked at him for a moment and then accepted the non-answer with the ease of someone who knew when to push and when to let a thing land where it would. They walked back toward the facility. The light continued its slow transformation of the desert into something that looked from a distance like it might be beautiful. At the facility entrance, Cross was coming out. He nearly walked into them, or nearly walked into Mara specifically, and pulled up short with the controlled reaction of a man who is always tracking his environment and had simply not tracked in this direction. He looked at Mara. She looked at him. Chief Petty Officer, he said. The rank was precise and entirely correct and communicated absolutely nothing beyond its technical accuracy. Captain, she said. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. The kind of held gaze that is not a challenge exactly, but is the warning that a challenge might follow, and that the ground between them was not settled. Then he stepped past, and the door closed, and he was gone. Mara exhaled through her nose. One small breath. He pulled my file, she said. Hale looked at the closed door. How do you know? She glanced at him. Because that look wasn't about today's shot anymore, she said. That look was about something he found. Hale made his call that night from the parking lot of a gas station 4 miles from the range facility, standing between his rental car and a propane cage with his phone pressed to his ear and the desert dark pressing in from every direction. The line rang twice. I was wondering when you'd call, the voice said. The voice belonged to a woman named Diane Solis, who held a position in the Defense Intelligence Agency that had 3 different official titles depending on which document you were reading, and none of them accurately described what she actually did. Hale had known her for 19 years, which was long enough to have shared a foxhole with her metaphorically on 4 separate occasions and literally on one. Cross pulled Vane's file today, Hale said. A pause. Not the pause of surprise, the pause of someone confirming a thing they'd already anticipated. How deep did he get? I don't know yet. Deep enough to change how he was looking at her. What does that mean, specifically? It means he walked out of a building and looked at her like he'd found something he wasn't expecting, something that made the shot today feel like a smaller part of a larger picture he didn't have before. Another pause. Longer. The compartment is intact, Solis said. He can't have gotten into the operational record. What he could have accessed, with his clearance level, from a flagged file, is the assignment history. The gaps. The gaps are enough. Yes, she said. They are. Hale looked up at the sky. This far from any city, the stars were unreasonable in their number and brightness, the kind of sky that people who'd spent their careers indoors under fluorescent lights had genuinely never seen. Is this going to become a problem for her? He said. That depends on what Cross does with what he found. If he sits on it, uses it as personal leverage, tries to manage her through it, that's manageable. If he escalates it up through channels and frames it as a security concern, Solis paused. That becomes a different conversation. What would he frame as a security concern? The Lashkar Valley operation, she said, with the flat neutrality of someone naming a thing that has a long tail. Specifically, the 7 months she spent in-country before the official record picks her up. If someone is asking the wrong questions, that gap looks like something it isn't. Hale was quiet. The Lashkar Valley operation was not something he had full visibility into. He knew the edges of it, knew that Mara had been in a situation that was not officially a situation, in a place that was not officially accessible, doing work that had required her to become something that didn't fit neatly into any category the military used to describe its people. He knew it had produced results. He knew it had cost her things he couldn't fully account for. He knew that when she'd come out the other side and landed in the R&D program where he'd first met her, she'd been carrying something that she hadn't put down exactly, but had learned to carry without showing. She needs to know, he said. She probably already knows, Solis said. That woman is about 3 steps ahead of most people in any given room. But yes, tell her. And tell her that if Cross escalates, I can intervene at the review stage, but not before. I can't be seen moving on this preemptively. Understood. Hale. Her voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, more deliberate. What she did today? The shot. Yes. Is it what I think it is? What do you think it is? A proof of concept, Solis said, for everything the program was trying to establish. Hale thought about Mara standing barefoot on burning ground, eyes closed, listening to something no one else was hearing. Yeah, he said. That's what it is. He told her the next morning at 05:30 in the range facility's empty briefing room before anyone else arrived. She was already there when he came in, sitting in the same chair she'd occupied during the debrief, notebook open, coffee from the commissary's overnight pot that had been sitting since midnight and tasted like something had been dissolved in it rather than brewed. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Lashkar Valley. Yes. He found the gap in the assignment history. That's what Solis thinks. She looked down at her notebook, made a small mark that wasn't writing, just the pen touching paper, once, the physical equivalent of a pause. The gap is 7 months, she said. From the outside, with no context, it looks like someone was somewhere they shouldn't have been, or someone was being someone they shouldn't have been. She glanced up, neither of which is straightforwardly wrong. The operational outcome justifies the method. That's a thing people say about operations that are hard to explain. She said it without bitterness. Matter of fact, the tone of someone describing a recurring pattern they've had time to accept. Cross isn't stupid. He's going to see the gap. He's going to see the classification level of what's behind it, and he's going to build a story that fits what he can see without knowing what he can't. And the story he builds makes me a liability, she said, or a question mark, which in this environment is the same thing. Hale sat down across from her. The room had the particular stillness of early morning in institutional spaces. HVAC, hum, distant generator, the sense of a building existing in the quiet before it had to perform its function. Solis can intervene if it goes to review, he said. That means it has to get to review first, which means Cross has to take a formal action rather than an informal one. She tapped the pen against her notebook once. Informal is worse. Formal, I can respond to. Formal, there's a process. Informal is just people in rooms deciding things. You've handled informal before. I've handled informal when I was invisible, she said. I'm not invisible anymore. That sat between them for a moment. Outside the briefing room, the facility was starting to wake up. Footsteps in the corridor. A door opening somewhere. The sound of the commissary beginning to produce something that would smell like breakfast within the hour. What do you want to do? Hale asked. She looked at him. I want to do the work, she said. That's it. I want to continue doing the work. Whatever they decide to make out of today, whatever story Cross tells, whatever the file looks like from the outside, none of that changes what the shot was, what it demonstrated, what it means for how this skill set can be developed in other people. That might not be enough. I know. She closed the notebook. But it's what I have. Cross moved faster than either of them anticipated. By Euro 900, he had requested a formal meeting with Voss. By 1000, Voss's aide had circulated an amended schedule for the day that included a 2-hour block marked simply as program review, restricted attendance. By 10:30, Hale had been quietly informed by the range CO that his observer status for the remainder of the assessment period was under review pending the outcome of that meeting. He was, in the careful language of the message, asked to remain available, but not to attend the morning's range activities. Mara received no message at all, which was its own kind of message. She and Hale were in the commissary when the amended schedule circulated. She was eating breakfast, eggs that had been cooked too long and toast that hadn't been cooked long enough, the universal output of institutional kitchen equipment running at scale, and she read the notification on her phone without changing her expression. 2 hours, she said. That's a substantive meeting, Hale said. That's not a quick conversation. He prepared something, he came in with documentation. She put the phone face down on the table. He must have been working on this last night. The timing of the file pull confirms that. He pulled it during the debrief. He's been building this since yesterday afternoon. She ate a forkful of eggs. They were clearly bad and she ate them anyway, with the practiced indifference of someone who had spent enough time in enough austere environments that the quality of food had become a largely irrelevant variable. What's his argument? She said. Hale thought about it. Operational unknown, he said. 7-month gap in verifiable assignment history. No unit accountability during a period that, from the outside, overlaps with some things that would be easier to misread than to understand correctly. He frames that as an unvetted variable in a program that just produced a result people are going to pay attention to. He's saying I'm a security risk. He's saying the program's confidence in you as an accessible quantity is incomplete, which is a more professional way of saying I'm a security risk. Yes. She ate more eggs, looked at the table for a moment. The thing about Lashkar Valley, she said, not quite looking at Hale, the thing that isn't in the file, the thing that the gap doesn't show, is that I was there because someone asked me to go. Someone who had the authority to ask and the reasons to ask, and who understood what it would require and sanctioned it anyway. She paused. I didn't go rogue, I didn't go off book. I went where I was sent, and I did what needed doing, and when it was over, there were people alive who wouldn't have been otherwise. That's the whole story. I know, Hale said. Cross doesn't. No. She looked up. Is Voss going to listen to him? Hale was honest. Voss is going to have to consider it. Cross has rank, he has institutional credibility, and he has a documented concern. Voss can't dismiss that without a process. And the process takes time. Yes. And during that time, your status in the program is uncertain. She absorbed this, set her fork down. How uncertain? Hale didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. That uncertain, she said. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Hale knew this because he spent most of them in the parking lot, in the narrow strip of shade provided by the building's overhang, watching the facility entrance and tracking time on his watch, with the particular patience of a man who had spent decades waiting for things he couldn't control to resolve themselves. Stearns came out first, at the 2-hour mark, with the body language of someone who had contributed their piece and been released. Abernathy followed 4 minutes later, moving quickly, phone already out. Neither of them looked toward Hale. Cross came out at 2:43. He walked to his vehicle, opened the door, stood with one hand on the roof, and looked across the parking lot for a moment before getting in. He didn't look at Hale. He looked at the desert beyond the perimeter fence, the same desert that had hosted yesterday's assessment, its face entirely indifferent to everything that had happened since, and his expression was the expression of a man who has done something he believes is correct and is finding that belief less satisfying than he expected. He got in the vehicle and drove away. Voss came out 11 minutes after that. He walked directly to Hale, which was purposeful. Voss was a purposeful man. He didn't do things accidentally, and he didn't walk toward people without deciding first that he was going to walk toward them. "Walk with me," Voss said. They walked along the building's perimeter, out of earshot of the range cadre who were moving between the facility and the firing positions in the middle distance. "Cross made a formal request for program review," Voss said. His voice was even, professional. The voice of a man presenting facts to someone he's decided deserves them. Specifically, he requested suspension of Chief Vane's participation in any follow-on activities pending a full review of her assignment history and the classification status of what he's calling an accountability gap. Hale waited. His argument is that a result of this profile, a documented first-in-program confirmed hit at that distance, in these conditions, will attract institutional attention, and that the program cannot fully account for the background of the individual who produced it. He's framing it as a chain of custody question, not a personal attack. "Of course not," Hale said. "In bureaucratic terms, it's a reasonable request. The file does have a gap. The gap is significant, and he's correct that this result will draw attention." Voss paused. "He's also correct that I have to respond to it." "What response did you give him?" Voss was quiet for 2 steps. 3. "I told him I would initiate a review," he said. "Standard protocol. The review process for a flagged file at her classification level goes to the program's oversight authority, not to Cross personally. It's not his review to conduct." Timeline? 48 to 72 hours for the oversight office to respond. During that window, Voss stopped walking. He turned to face Hale directly. "During that window, I am authorizing Chief Vane's continued participation in the program's supplementary activities. She is not suspended. She is not restricted. What she is under observation, which in practical terms means I need her to be visible, accountable, and documented at every stage." Hale looked at him. "You're not giving Cross what he asked for," he said. "I'm giving him the process he's entitled to. The outcome of that process is not determined yet." Voss held his gaze. "She hit the shot, Rowan. In 22 years running assessments, I have never had a confirmed hit at that distance, in those conditions, by any shooter from any branch. What she did yesterday is real. What it means for the program is real. I'm not going to let a personnel dispute erase that before we've had time to understand it." Hale exhaled slowly. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. The acknowledgement that the person he'd needed to be reasonable had chosen, for now, to be reasonable. "There's something you should know about the Lashkar Valley Gap," Hale said. Voss waited. "It's sanctioned. The operation was sanctioned at a level that Cross doesn't have access to, and the outcome was significant. The gap doesn't mean what it looks like from the outside. Can you get me documentation? I can get you a person, someone who can speak to the oversight authority directly." Voss nodded once, the nod of a man adding a piece to a structure he's building. "Do it," he said. "Today." The supplementary activities that Voss had referenced were a second phase of the assessment that most participants had understood to be lower stakes, target analysis exercises, team-based observation challenges, a series of low-tech environmental reading tests that the program used to generate data on how operators processed complex terrain information. Under normal circumstances, Mara's role in this phase would have been straightforward: participate, be assessed, generate data. Under the current circumstances, every moment of her participation was documented in triplicate. She didn't know this, or she knew it the way she knew most things about rooms she was in, as a background fact, registered and filed, not interfering with the work. The first supplementary exercise ran at 1400 on the North Range, a terrain analysis problem that asked each participant to study a 600-meter stretch of broken desert terrain for 20 minutes. Then provide a written assessment of which 3 positions offered optimal concealment and field of observation for a 2-person element. The exercise had a correct answer developed by the range cadre, weighted towards specific criteria, and most participants produced assessments that hit 2 of the 3 designated positions and provided reasonable justification for their choices. Mara identified all 3 designated positions. She also identified a 4th position that wasn't on the cadre's list, provided a written justification for why it should have been, and attached a hand-drawn sketch showing the line-of-sight geometry from that position that the cadre's original terrain analysis had apparently not considered. The range officer running the exercise, A Marine gunnery sergeant named Tillis, with the weathered patience of a man who had been surprised before and expected to be surprised again, read her submission twice before calling it. Van, Tillis said. She looked up from the table where she'd been waiting. This fourth position. He tapped the sketch. The outcrop at the northern edge. Yes. Our analysis didn't include it because the sight line to the primary observation axis is blocked by the ridge at the 200-meter mark. The sight line to the primary axis is blocked, she said. The sight line to the secondary axis, the approach route along the drainage, is not. From that position you can't see the main problem, but you can see anyone trying to solve the main problem from behind. Tillis looked at the sketch. Counter-observation position, he said. Whoever controls that outcrop controls the information about who's controlling the terrain. Tillis made a mark on his clipboard. He did it slowly, the mark of someone being deliberate, and he didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The mark was its own commentary. Merritt, sitting 2 seats from Mara, had been watching the exchange. He didn't say anything either. He looked back at his own submission and then looked at his hands for a moment, the posture of a man revisiting something he thought was finished. The second supplementary exercise was a wind-reading challenge, not a shooting problem, a pure observation problem. Participants were given instruments, atmospheric tables, and a complex of terrain markers, and asked to predict the wind behavior at a designated point 900 meters away across a broken terrain feature. The prediction was then tested by releasing a smoke canister at the measuring point and observing the drift. 12 of the participants used the instruments and the tables. Their predictions ranged from reasonable to excellent. 2 of them nailed the wind direction with accuracy that was genuinely impressive. Mara put down the instruments after 4 minutes. She spent the remaining time watching the terrain markers, small flags on wire posts that the range had placed at regular intervals, and the dust patterns at the surface, and the heat shimmer off 2 rock formations at the terrain's midpoint. Her predicted wind speed at the target point was within half a mile per hour of the actual reading. Her predicted direction was exact. Tillis made another mark. By the end of the afternoon supplementary phase, something had shifted in the room that was different from the shift at the firing line the previous day. Yesterday, the shift had been shock, the disruption of a single dramatic event. This was accumulation. The quiet building of evidence, exercise by exercise, that what Mara had done at 4,200 meters was not a lucky anomaly. It was the visible peak of a capability that operated continuously, at every scale, in every environment she encountered. The men who had been revising their assessments since yesterday were revising them further. The men who hadn't been revising them were getting uncomfortable. Cross called at 17:15, while Hale was outside on his second call of the day with Solace, updating her on Voss's decision and the review timeline. The call was from a number Hale didn't recognize, which meant Cross had used a secondary line, the kind of operational caution that was itself a signal. He let it ring. Cross didn't leave a message. Hale finished with Solace, who confirmed that she could have someone at the Oversight Authority by end of business the following day, and that the documentation could be provided in a form that addressed the accountability gap without requiring full declassification of the operational record. It was the best possible outcome of the call, and he accepted it without celebration because the thing wasn't done yet, and celebrating incomplete things was a habit that got people in trouble. He found Mara at the far end of the North Range's observation deck, sitting on the railing with her legs over the outside and the desert dropping away below her in the long amber light of early evening. It was not a safe position. The deck was 12 feet above a rocky slope, and she was sitting in it with the easy unconsciousness of someone for whom awareness of physical risk has become so internalized it no longer registers as caution. "Good day," Hale said. "Productive day," she said. The distinction was deliberate. Tillis filed his report. "You flagged a position his cadre missed in a terrain analysis they'd been running for 2 years. The counter-obs position." She looked out at the desert. "It's not that they didn't know the concept. They just analyzed the terrain for the problem they designed. They didn't analyze it for the problem someone else might design in response. That's the lesson. That's always the lesson," she said. "You plan for your own operation. You forget to plan for the person who's watching you plan." Hale leaned on the railing beside her. The desert at this hour was doing the thing it always did, transforming itself from something brutal into something that could be mistaken for beautiful, the light pulling copper and gold from rock that spent the rest of the day looking like nothing at all. Solis will have someone at the Oversight Authority tomorrow afternoon, he said. The review should move quickly after that. She nodded, didn't speak. Mara. She looked at him. Cross called me, he said. Didn't leave a message. Something moved across her face. Brief. He's going to try to talk to you directly, outside the process. Yes. Don't let him reframe what happened yesterday. I don't intend to. I mean specifically, she stopped herself, started again. He's going to try to separate the shot from the method. He's going to argue that the result was real, but the approach isn't reproducible, isn't teachable, isn't something the program can build on. And if he gets that argument to stick, then the shot becomes a data point, and I become a question mark, a gap, a thing that happened once and doesn't justify further investment. Hale was quiet. He's not entirely wrong, she said, and the honesty of it was very clean, no self-pity in it. The specific method isn't directly teachable. You can't teach someone to feel what I feel when I'm in a terrain environment. What you can teach is the discipline that enables it, the observation habits, the willingness to set down the instrument and just look, listen, let the environment tell you what it knows. That's what the program is built to do. The program is built to explore it. We haven't proven it scales. She looked back at the desert. Yesterday was evidence that it's real. It's not proof that it transfers. Then that's what comes next, Hale said. We build the proof. If Cross doesn't shut it down first, he'd need Voss to shut it down. Voss has limits, she said quietly. He's reasonable and he's fair, and he's also a commander who operates inside an institution with its own logic. If the pressure from Cross becomes institutional rather than personal, if Stearns and Abernathy back him, if this gets framed as a program integrity question rather than a personnel dispute, Voss can't hold it alone. Then we give him what he needs to hold it, Hale said. Solis, the documentation, and everything you're building in the exercises. She looked at him for a moment. The light had changed again, doing something to the color of the sky that happened for maybe 10 minutes each evening in this place and nowhere else. You really believe this is worth fighting for, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I believe you're worth fighting for, he said. The program, the methodology, the proof of concept, those matter. But they're not what I'm here for. She was quiet for a long time. You know what the worst part of Lashkar Valley was? She said finally, not looking at him, looking at the desert. He waited. Not the operation itself, not what it required, not what it cost. She paused. The worst part was coming out the other side and discovering that the thing I'd learned to do, the thing I'd become in order to survive and function in that environment, was something that had no recognized category, no place in the existing framework. I had developed a capability that the institution didn't have language for, and so, to the institution, it didn't exist. She stopped. Yesterday was the first time it existed. The desert held them both. Below the observation deck, the range was going through its end-of-day procedures. Equipment stowed, positions logged, the formal closing of the day's activities that military organizations performed with the same ritual consistency, regardless of what the day had contained. Cross is going to come at me again, she said. Not through the file. He's used that. He's going to come at the methodology itself. He's going to find a scenario where my approach fails, and he's going to use it to build the case that yesterday was the anomaly. You think he's already planning that? I think that's how he operates. He's not a malicious person. He's a thorough one. She pulled her legs back over the railing and stood up on the deck, and Hale noticed that her boots were on and properly laced, which meant she'd made a choice at some point in the past few hours to be ready. He's going to manufacture a test condition that challenges the methodology on its weakest ground. What's the weakest ground? She looked at him. Speed, she said. Everything I do requires time. Observation takes time. Environmental learning takes time. In a scenario that compresses the timeline, a rapid engagement, a target that appears and disappears in seconds, everything I rely on is stripped away, and I'm left with what everyone else has. Instruments, tables, numbers. And at that point, I'm a 31-year-old chief petty officer with good range scores and a questionable file, standing in a room full of men who have been doing this longer. She said it without drama. Just the arithmetic of it, stated plainly. That's Cross's play. I'd bet my next 2 years on it. Hale looked at her. Then we need to make sure that when that scenario arrives, he said, you're ready for it. She looked back at the desert one more time as the light finally finished its daily transformation and the colors began their slow pull toward dark. I've been ready for it since Lashkar Valley, she said. I just haven't had to prove it in front of witnesses before. Cross's test came at 06:45 the next morning, before Hale had finished his first coffee. It wasn't announced as a test. It was announced as a supplementary live fire exercise, unscheduled, inserted into the morning block by Voss's office at Cross's request, framed as a practical extension of the previous day's terrain analysis work. The notification reached participants via the range's internal messaging system at 0620, which gave everyone 25 minutes to gear up and get to the south firing line. 25 minutes was not an accident. Hale read the notification standing in the doorway of the commissary and understood immediately what it was. The timeline compression, the lack of preparation window, the framing as an extension of existing work rather than a new challenge, which meant no specific mental preparation, no time to build the observation baseline that Mara's methodology required. He looked across the commissary to where Mara was sitting with her notebook and her bad coffee, and she was already looking at him, and her expression confirmed that she had understood it at least as quickly as he had. Rapid engagement scenario, she said when he reached her table. That's my read. Timeline? 25 minutes to the south line. He had this ready. He designed it overnight. She looked at her notebook for a moment, not reading it, just looking at it the way you look at something familiar when you need a second to think. What's on the south line? She said. I don't know the specifics. The notification just says live fire, practical assessment, all JPMA participants. Who authorized it? Voss's office issued it, which means Cross got Voss to sign off. She was quiet. Or Voss let him have it, she said slowly, as a controlled test, to generate more data. Hale hadn't considered that. He considered it now. Voss was a careful man, a man who believed in evidence. If Cross had come to him with a legitimate methodological challenge, your assessment produced one result under one set of conditions. Demonstrate it holds under different conditions. Voss might have decided that giving Cross the rope was better than denying him and leaving the question open. Either way, Mara said, we go. She closed the notebook, put it in her pocket, and finished the rest of her coffee in one long drink that expressed more about her feelings toward the situation than anything she'd said. The south firing line at Raven Rock was a different animal from the North Range where the assessment had been conducted. Where the North Range was open, long sight lines, exposed terrain, the brutal geometry of distance. The south line was compressed. Rocky outcroppings created a broken, irregular landscape that topped out at around 800 meters before the terrain folded into a canyon system that blocked further distance. It was a precision problem rather than an extreme range problem, which meant the technical difficulty was different in kind. The challenge, as Voss explained it to the assembled participants at 0710, was this. A series of steel targets would appear and disappear at randomized intervals across the South Range's broken terrain. Each target was visible for between 4 and 12 seconds. The targets were positioned at varying distances between 200 and 800 meters, in positions that changed between each shooter's turn. The sequence was computer-controlled and unknown to participants. Each shooter had 1 minute from the start signal to engage as many targets as possible. Standard scoring, hit ratio, time to first engagement, number of engagements attempted. It was, Hale recognized, an almost perfectly designed counter to Mara's demonstrated strengths. There was no time for passive environmental observation. There was no opportunity for a diagnostic first shot. The targets appeared and disappeared on a schedule that bore no relationship to any environmental rhythm she could read in advance. The only relevant skills were reaction speed, pre-acquired ballistic knowledge, and the ability to build a firing solution in seconds rather than minutes. It was, in other words, the test that Cross had told no one he was designing. The shooters went in order of the previous day's assessment ranking, which put Mara last again. Hale wasn't certain if Cross had arranged that or if it had fallen that way naturally. It didn't matter much. Last meant she watched every other shooter go first, which was information, though not the kind the test was designed to generate. Coyle went first. He was quick, genuinely, impressively quick, with the fluid efficiency of someone who had trained the rapid engagement sequence until it was below the level of conscious thought. He hit 4 targets in 60 seconds, missed 2, had time on 2 others that disappeared before he completed his solution. His hit ratio was 67%, which the range cadre's expression suggested was strong. Merritt hit 5. His time to first engagement was faster than Coyle's by nearly half a second, which was a significant margin at this level. The Air Force ST Sergeant Duran hit 4 cleanly and attempted a 5th that he hit as the target was dropping. The round caught the edge of the steel as it descended, and the cadre ruled it a partial. He looked frustrated in the precise, controlled way of someone who has an emotional response and has trained the expression down to almost nothing, but not quite all the way. One by one they went. The scores ranged from 2 confirmed hits to Merritt's 5. The pattern that emerged was consistent with what Hale expected. The best rapid engagement scores came from the men whose training had most emphasized close to medium range work under time pressure, which was a different skill set from the one that had been tested the previous day. Yesterday's top performers, Coyle, Duran, were middle of the pack today. Men who had been unremarkable at 4,200 meters were posting strong numbers at 200 to 800. Cross watched from the observer's position with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man monitoring something he expects to confirm his prior assessment. He hadn't spoken to Hale since the previous day's parking lot exchange, which Hale read as deliberate. Cross was managing the distance between them with the same purposeful care he brought to everything. When the 12th shooter stepped back from the line, the range went into a 2-minute reset while the cadre repositioned the target array for the final run. Mara stood at the back of the assembled group with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the South Range terrain. She wasn't moving, wasn't consulting anything, just looking at the landscape with the steady attention she brought to all landscapes. Hale moved to stand near her without making it a meeting. Just proximity, 2 people standing in the same direction. "You've been watching the target positions," he said, quietly enough that it was between them. "The array isn't fully random," she said. Her voice was very low. "The computer generates a random sequence, but the target positions themselves are fixed. There are 8 positions in the terrain. I've identified 6 of them from watching the previous 12 runs." Hale was still. "The 6th one is behind that rock formation at the 400-meter mark," she said. "Left edge, I've seen it twice. It appeared for a Coyle run and a Merritt run. It's the one that neither of them hit. The angle from the firing bench puts the target in the rock's shadow at this hour, which makes it difficult to acquire in the transition from the bright terrain to the shadow zone. So you adjust for the light transition. I adjust my position slightly on the bench to change the angle relative to the shadow." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not the methodology Cross is testing. That's just observation. That's just watching. It's the same thing." "To me it is," she said. "To him, it's going to look like preparation. Advantage. He'll argue the test wasn't equitable." "Let him argue that," Hale said. "What he's actually arguing, if that's his response, is that watching your environment more carefully than other people is an unfair advantage. He can explain that position to Voss." Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. "Vane!" Voss called from the line. She walked forward. The 60 seconds that followed were not what anyone present was expecting, and Hale would spend a significant amount of time afterward trying to articulate precisely why. It was not that she was faster than the other shooters. She wasn't. Her time to first engagement was slightly slower than Merritt's, and her transitions between targets were measured rather than lightning fast. It was not that she was technically superior in the mechanics of rapid fire. She was excellent, clearly trained, but the Delta operators and the Niçabois shooters had a mechanical fluency that matched or exceeded hers at close to medium range. What was different was something harder to name. She moved on the bench with the settled economy of someone who knew exactly where she was going before she got there. When a target appeared, she was already arriving at the acquisition angle rather than reacting to the appearance and then moving. When one disappeared and the next appeared, she transitioned with a directness that suggested she had a reasonable prior on where the next one would be. She didn't search, she went. The target behind the rock formation's shadow, the one that had defeated both Coyle and Merritt, appeared in the 41st second of her run. She had shifted her position on the bench by approximately 3 inches at the start of the exercise, an adjustment so small that only Hale had noticed it. and when the shadow zone target appeared, she was already indexed to the angle that put the steel in the light rather than the dark. Her shot was unhurried relative to the time pressure and hit cleanly. When the 60 seconds ended, Polk called the score. 6 confirmed hits, 1 partial, 0 misses on attempted engagements. The partial was a target that had appeared in the final 3 seconds, and she'd fired as it was already descending, clipping the upper edge of the steel. 7 engagements, 6 clean hits. An attempted to confirmed ratio of 100% on full exposure targets. Nobody said anything for a moment. Cross lowered his arms from their crossed position. It was a small movement. Hale watched it. Tillis, the gunnery sergeant who had been running the supplementary exercises, was writing on his clipboard with the deliberate motion of a man being very careful to record exactly what he'd seen. He wrote for longer than the score required. Coyle, standing 2 positions to Hale's left, exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the same sound he'd made when Polk called the confirmed hit at 4,200 meters. Not defeat, not entirely, but the sound of a revision happening in real time. Merritt said, very quietly, to no one in particular, she knew where the targets were going to be. Hale said nothing. Duran, beside Merritt, shook his head slightly. She watched us, mapped the positions while we were running, then she shot the map instead of reacting to the appearances. That's not the test, Merritt said. That's exactly the test, Duran said. The test is, can you engage effectively under time pressure? She engaged effectively under time pressure. How she built the solution is not the criterion. Merritt didn't respond. He looked at the South Range terrain for a moment, then looked at the ground. Cross walked to Voss. Hale moved to follow, and Voss's slight head movement, a millimeter of acknowledgement in his direction, indicated that his presence was permitted. The target positions were observable, Cross said. He was controlled, professional, making an argument, not throwing a fit. She spent 12 rotations collecting positional data that wasn't available to the shooters who went earlier. That's a sequencing advantage that invalidates direct comparison. Every shooter in this assessment had access to the same observation window, Voss said. They weren't using it as a data collection phase. No, they were using it to prepare mentally for their own run. Voss looked at Cross steadily. Chief Vane used it to build information about the environment she was about to operate in. That's not a sequencing advantage. That's a methodological difference. Voss? Adrian. Voss said the first name quietly, and it landed differently than the rank would have. What outcome are you looking for here? Cross was silent. You requested this exercise, Voss continued. The implicit argument was that yesterday's result, the 4,200-meter hit, was specific to conditions that favored her approach, and that a different condition set would demonstrate the approach's limitations. That's a legitimate methodological question, and I took it seriously. He paused. She just hit 6 of 6 attempted targets, including the shadow position that defeated your 2 top rapid engagement shooters, using an observational preparation methodology that she developed in plain sight of everyone present. What outcome were you expecting? Cross looked at him for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly. I was expecting the data to be ambiguous, he said finally. I was expecting enough variance to justify the review. It's not ambiguous. The file is under review through the appropriate channel, Voss said. Solis's office contacted my oversight authority this morning. The review will be complete by end of business today. The accountability gap has a documented explanation that addresses your concern. He paused. Is there something else? Cross looked at Mara, who was at the firing bench doing her post-exercise clearing procedure. Magazine out, chamber check, safety on. With the precise, unhurried attention she gave everything mechanical. She was not looking at them. She was looking at the rifle. She spent 7 months in Lashkar Valley, Cross said. Not loud. Almost private between the 3 of them. Whatever she was doing there, whatever she became there, that's what I'm looking at when I watch her work. And I don't have a category for it. Hale was quiet. Voss was quiet. Cross looked at the desert. I need a category, he said. That's the issue. It's not the file. It's not the gap. It's that I cannot fit what she does into an existing framework, and things I can't fit into a framework are things I don't know how to assess for risk. The honesty of it was unexpected. Hale felt it land differently than everything Cross had said before, because this was not institutional posturing or bureaucratic maneuvering. This was a man admitting, in the particular vocabulary of someone who operated in threat assessment mode as a baseline, that he was encountering a genuine limit of his own comprehension. That's the program's purpose, Hale said. Cross looked at him. What she does doesn't fit the existing framework because the existing framework wasn't built to hold it. The program exists to build a new framework, to create the category. Cross said nothing. That's why the JPMA invited her, Hale continued. Not to see if she could perform within the existing model, to see what the existing model was missing. Another silence. The desert held all three of them in its vast indifference. She needs to tell me about Lashkar Valley, Cross said finally. Hale looked at him. Not the operational record, Cross said. I understand I don't have access. I mean, what it did to her, how it built what I'm watching. I need to understand the mechanism, not the event. Hale looked at Mara. She had finished clearing the rifle and was standing at the bench with her notebook out, writing something. She had the posture of someone who has been listening to a conversation 30 feet away and has chosen not to indicate that she's heard it. You'd have to ask her yourself, Hale said. Cross's expression moved. Several things crossed it in sequence. Resistance, calculation, and something that was the distant cousin of humility, before it settled into something that wasn't any of those but contained elements of all three. I know, he said. The afternoon was quieter than the morning had deserved to make it. The program review notification from Solis's oversight contact arrived at 1340, transmitted through Voss's office in the form of a 2-paragraph memo with a classification marking that ended the formal review process cleanly. The memo addressed the Lashkar Valley gap with the kind of language that bureaucratic systems used when they needed to close a question without opening what was behind it. Sanctioned, documented, outcome positive, no ongoing security concern. It was minimal and sufficient, and Cross received a copy through his own channels within the hour. Hale didn't see Cross's reaction to the memo directly. He heard about it from Tillis, who had heard it from the range CO, who had been present when Cross read it in Voss's office. The reaction, apparently, was a long silence followed by a single question. Is the outcome documentation available for review? And when the answer was no, Cross had nodded once and said nothing further. That was something. Not much, but something. The formal part of the assessment concluded at 1600 with a brief ceremony that wasn't really a ceremony, Voss making a statement about the program's purpose, the range CO presenting each participant with a record of their assessment scores, the institutional handshake that marked the end of a thing and the beginning of its paperwork. 13 shooters moving through the motions with the practiced ease of people who had attended many of these closings and understood their function. Mara received her scoring record, shook Voss's hand, stepped back into the line. She looked at the paper for a moment. Her expression when she looked at it was the expression of someone reading data rather than validation, checking figures, noting relationships, filing the information. Cross was at the end of the line. He watched her receive her record and step back, and then he stepped forward for his own, and for a moment they were adjacent, 2 feet between them, both facing Voss. It was the closest they'd been since the conversation outside the facility entrance the previous evening. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But when they both stepped back and the line began to disperse, Cross did not immediately move away. He stood holding his scoring record with both hands, looking at the document, and then he looked at Mara with the expression of someone who has been revising a position across 48 hours and has arrived, finally, at the revision's end. Chief Petty Officer, he said. She looked at him. The shadow position target, he said, at the 400-meter mark. Yes. My 2 shooters missed it because of the light transition. That's my assessment. You adjusted your bench position at the start of your run, 3 or 4 inches to the left. She looked at him without confirming or denying, waiting to see where he was going. I've been trying to figure out when you made that decision, Cross said. You didn't move to the bench and then adjust. You sat down in the adjusted position, which means you decided before you got on the bench. Yes. Which means you knew the shadow position target would be a problem from the observation phase. I suspected it would be a factor for anyone running at this time of morning, given the sun angle. I knew it had defeated 2 runs already. He was quiet for a moment. At what point during the observation phase did you identify the shadow position as a priority variable? She thought about this. 3rd run, she said, when Merritt missed it. Coyle had missed it also, but I thought Coyle's miss might have been target acquisition speed. When Merritt missed it, Merritt's acquisition speed is excellent. I started looking at the environmental cause and identified the light transition. Within the next 2 runs, yes. Cross looked at his scoring record, then at her. The expression on his face was doing something that Hale, watching from 8 feet away, found difficult to name. Not quite respect still, but the thing that precedes respect in people for whom respect is not a default setting. The clearing away of objections. The reluctant recognition of a thing that has been confirmed beyond reasonable challenge. I want to understand how you developed this, Cross said. Not the operational history, the cognitive mechanism. How someone trains themselves to process an environment the way you do. Mara looked at him steadily. You don't train yourself to process it, she said. You train yourself to stop filtering it out. Most people, most trained people, most professionals, we learn to process our environment selectively. We filter to the operationally relevant information and discard the rest. It makes us faster, more decisive, less overwhelmed. She paused. But the filter also removes things that don't fit the operational template we've been trained to apply. Things that matter, but not in ways the template recognizes. So you remove the filter. You loosen it. You can't remove it entirely. You drown in data. But you can learn to hold it more lightly, to let things through that the trained response would have blocked. Cross was quiet for a moment. That sounds like it creates vulnerabilities, decision paralysis, overload. It can, she said, if you do it wrong, or if you do it in the wrong context. The skill isn't removing the filter. The skill is knowing when to loosen it and when to tighten it back up. She met his eyes. Yesterday at the line, the filter was loose. During this morning's run, it was tight. I'd already done the environmental work during the observation phase, and when the clock started, I wasn't processing anymore. I was executing. Cross absorbed this. The process of it was visible in a way that he probably didn't realize. A man genuinely turning a new concept over, testing its edges, looking for where it broke down. In Lashkar Valley, he said, the name carefully neutral. Is that where you learned to do this? Mara looked at him for a long moment. Lashkar Valley is where I learned it wasn't optional, she said. Cross held her gaze. Then he nodded. A single, small movement. The nod of a man accepting an answer that gives him less than he wanted and more than he expected. He looked at Hale. The program review, he said. My formal request. I'd like to withdraw it. Hale said nothing. That requires notification to Voss's office, Cross continued, and to the oversight authority that Solis engaged. I'll handle that through the appropriate channels today. That's your call to make, Hale said. Yes. Cross looked at the desert for a moment. It is. He walked back toward the facility. Straight line, unhurried, the walk of a man who has decided something and is moving toward the next thing. Hale watched him go. Mara was already looking at her notebook. Voss found Hale at 17:30 in the parking lot where this had started 2 days ago, in the same strip of overhang shade that had become Hale's default position for conversations that required privacy and proximity to the facility simultaneously. Cross withdrew the review request, Voss said. I know. Solis's documentation helped. The morning exercise helped more. Voss stood with his hands in his pockets, an unusually informal posture for him, which meant the formal part of today was done. Cross is not a dishonest person. He's a person who needs evidence. He got evidence. He also needs frameworks, Hale said. He said as much. He can't evaluate risk on something he can't categorize. Which is why the program needs to produce the framework, Voss said. Not just the results, the documentation, the methodology made explicit, the reproducible elements identified and named. He paused. I want to talk to you about next steps. I thought you might. The program has produced 2 days of data that I cannot explain using the existing assessment literature. The 4,200-meter shot, the rapid engagement scores, the terrain analysis work, the wind reading exercise. Voss looked at him. All of it points to a coherent capability set that we have no established protocol for developing or evaluating, which means the program's next phase needs to produce that protocol. Mara can help build it, Hale said. That's the point. The point was never just the assessment. The point was whether the capability was real and whether it was teachable. Is it teachable? The discipline is. The observation habits, the willingness to loosen the filter. He thought about how Mara had said it. Whether someone develops what she has at the level she has it, that probably depends on the individual. But the baseline capacity, the environmental awareness, the real-time terrain reading, that can be trained. We just haven't had a model for how to train it. Now we have one, Voss said. If she's willing. Voss looked at him. You think she might not be? Hale considered the question honestly. She's been doing this alone for a long time, he said, in environments that didn't have a framework for what she was. She's learned to carry it as a private thing. He paused. Becoming the model, the person others are trained to emulate, is a different kind of exposure. It has costs. Everything has costs, Voss said. Yes. Hale looked at the desert. She knows that better than most. Voss was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon light was doing its usual work on the landscape, pulling it toward something that didn't match what it had been at noon. I'd like to offer her a formal role in the program's next phase, Voss said. Curriculum development, assessment design. She'd be the methodological lead for the environmental cognition component. That's a significant offer. It's a significant capability. He paused. She hit a shot that 13 elite operators couldn't make, in conditions that 3 separate computational models declared essentially non-solvable. Then she mapped a target array from passive observation and posted a perfect hit ratio in a rapid engagement exercise designed to defeat her approach. He turned to Hale. I'm not in the habit of underusing assets like that. Hale nodded slowly. Tell her yourself, he said. Tonight, if you can, before she starts processing a reason to say no. Voss's expression moved, the ghost of something that, on a less controlled man, would have been a smile. Noted, he said. Deck. She was on the observation deck again when Voss found her, in the same position as the previous evening. Legs over the railing, desert dropping away below, the sky going through its nightly transformation from brutal to something else. Hale watched from the parking lot, too far to hear. He could see the conversation, Voss's posture and Mara's, the particular geometry of an offer being made and received. He could see Mara look at Voss for a long time when he finished speaking, the stillness of someone processing something important rather than something easy. He could see the moment she decided. She swung her legs back over the railing and stood up on the deck and said something, and Voss nodded once, and she looked out at the desert for a moment before she nodded in return. Not enthusiastically, not with the visible relief of someone who has been waiting for this. Just the nod of a person who has been offered a thing that is right for reasons she understands clearly and has decided to accept it because declining it would be a waste, and waste was something she didn't do. Hale put his coffee down on the hood of the rental car. In 2 days, Raven Rock Desert Range had produced something that nobody had designed it to produce. Not just the shot, though the shot was real and documented and would be cited in program reports for years. What it had produced was the beginning of a language, a set of terms for a capability that had existed without terms, a framework for something that had only been visible, until now, in its results, in a 7-month gap in a file, in an impossible hit at 4,200 meters, in 6 clean engagements on a rapid-fire course that had been designed to expose a weakness. The weakness hadn't appeared. What had appeared instead was something that Cross had correctly identified as operating outside the existing category system. And that was exactly the point. You couldn't build a new category from inside the old ones. You had to stand somewhere outside them and describe what you were looking at. Mara Vane had been standing outside them her entire career. The difference now was that someone had finally thought to hand her a pen. The drive back to Reno took 90 minutes on a highway that ran through the kind of empty that people who grew up in cities never fully believed in until they saw it. No towns, no signs of habitation, just the highway cutting through basin and range country in a straight line that the terrain didn't seem to care about in either direction. Mara drove. Hale rode in the passenger seat with his window down and his elbow on the door, and the desert air moving through the car at 70 miles an hour, warm even at this hour, carrying the particular smell of Nevada high desert at the end of summer, dry rock and sage and something mineral underneath that didn't have a name. They didn't talk for the first 40 minutes. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had been in close operational proximity for 72 hours and had expended the social energy that required, and we're now in the decompression phase where words cost more than they return. Mara drove like she did everything, with a settled economy of movement, no excess, hands at 9 and 3, eyes tracking the road and the mirrors and the terrain beyond the shoulder with the automatic environmental awareness that had, over 3 days, shifted in Hale's perception from remarkable to simply characteristic. This was how she was. In the desert, in the briefing room, behind a rifle, in a vehicle on a dark Nevada highway, the same quality of attention, the same relationship with her surroundings. The instrument wasn't the thing. The operator was the thing. He'd always known that technically. This week had made it concrete. Voss's offer, he said when they were 45 minutes out. I know. You said yes, but I don't know what yes means to you in this context. She was quiet for a moment. The highway unrolled ahead of them. It means I'm going to try, she said, which is different from knowing it'll work. The curriculum development piece, that part I understand. I've been building the framework in my head for 3 years. I know what the observable components are. I know which ones transfer and which ones probably don't. Putting it into language. She paused. That's the part that worries me. Why? Because the moment you write something down, it becomes the thing instead of the thing behind it. She glanced at him briefly and looked back at the road. I've seen it happen in other training contexts. Someone develops an approach, someone writes it into doctrine, and the doctrine replaces the understanding. People learn to perform the written procedure instead of learning to understand what the procedure was trying to capture. That's a real risk. I know how to mitigate it, partially. She shifted lanes for an oncoming truck and shifted back. You build the assessment criteria around outcomes, not procedures. You measure whether the student can read the environment, not whether they followed the steps you wrote down. But that requires evaluators who understand what they're measuring, and right now there's exactly one of those. 2, Hale said. She looked at him. I can build the evaluator capacity alongside the curriculum, he said. That's my piece. You build the what? I build the people who can assess it. She was quiet for a moment. You're not retired anymore, she said. Consulting capacity. Voss offered it before he left the deck. She absorbed this. He moved fast. He knows what he has. Hale looked out at the dark desert. He's not going to leave it sitting on the shelf. They reached the outskirts of Reno at 21:30, the city's light pollution announcing itself against the sky. 20 minutes before the first buildings appeared. Mara pulled into the airport hotel's parking lot and cut the engine and sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel. There's something I didn't tell Voss, she said. Hale waited. When he was making the offer, he framed it as curriculum development, methodology lead, formal program role. She looked at the hotel entrance, glass doors, fluorescent lobby light bleeding out into the dark parking lot. What he didn't ask, and what I should have volunteered, is that there's a version of this that doesn't work. A version where the program becomes what programs become when they get institutionalized, where the framework becomes rigid, where the assessment becomes a gate rather than a lens, where the methodology gets used to select people instead of develop them. That's a legitimate concern. If the program turns into a filter, if it becomes a way to identify people who already have the capability and credential them, then we've built something useful but not something transformative. The real value is in people who don't know they have this yet, people who have the capacity but nobody's ever pointed them in the right direction. Hale looked at her. You're describing yourself. Before the program. She looked at her hands on the wheel. I'm describing most of the people who will never get a slot at JPMA because their file looks wrong or their unit didn't nominate them or they're in the wrong billet at the wrong time. She paused. The shot at 4,200 meters doesn't mean anything if the program it generates only reaches people who are already standing on the firing line. This was the clearest she had been, across all of it, about what she actually wanted. Not the assessment slot, not the confirmed hit, not the institutional recognition. What she wanted was the downstream consequence, the version of this that reached further than she could see from where she was standing. Tell Voss that, Hale said. I will. Not in a meeting, not in a memo. Tell him directly. The way you just told me. She looked at him. You think he'll hear it? I think Voss is a man who responds to direct communication from people who know what they're talking about. He held her gaze. You know what you're talking about. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not good at this part, she said. The admission came out without performance, just a fact. stated plainly, from someone who had spent enough time being honest that pretending otherwise didn't occur to her as an option. The institutional part. The rooms where you explain yourself and make the case and manage the politics of it. You did all right with Cross. Cross came to me. I didn't go to him. And when he came to you, you spoke plainly, and he heard you. That's the same skill. Hale opened the car door. The Nevada night came in, still warm, carrying that sage and mineral smell. The work is the same. The environment is different. Read the environment. She looked at him for a moment, then she got out of the car. 6 weeks later, Mara Vane walked into a conference room at a facility in Virginia that she'd been to once before, for a very different reason, and sat down across a table from 4 people who held, collectively, more authority over the program's future than anyone else in the chain. Voss was there. Solis was there. A 2-star admiral named Garrett, who ran Naval Special Warfare's training and readiness function, was there. And Adrian Cross was there, which was a thing that Mara had not been told in advance, and which she processed, when she saw him, with a moment of adjustment that she kept internal and moved past. Cross looked at her when she came in. He nodded. She nodded. Whatever that exchange communicated, it was not hostility. The meeting was 2 hours long and covered things that Mara had spent the previous 6 weeks preparing for. The curriculum framework, the assessment criteria, the evaluator development program, the access pipeline that would allow candidates from non-traditional billets to be considered. She'd written 31 pages of documentation that she was privately unhappy with because it didn't fully capture what it was trying to capture. And she'd written it anyway, because imperfect documentation was better than a framework that lived only in her head. She presented. She answered questions. The Admiral asked hard questions about scalability and resource requirements, and she answered them honestly, including the parts where the honest answer was, "I don't know yet. Here's how I'd find out." Cross asked one question near the end. "The access pipeline," he said. "You're proposing that candidates can be nominated from any billet, any branch, any career stage, not just senior operators with existing marksmanship credentials." Yes, that significantly expands the pool. It also significantly expands the evaluation burden. Yes. What's your argument for accepting that burden? Mara looked at him. The people who have the capability I'm trying to develop are not disproportionately concentrated in the positions that currently generate JPMA nominees, she said. If we restrict access to people who already look like elite operators, we will find elite operators who have the capacity. We will miss everyone else who has it. The shot at 4,200 meters wasn't made by someone on the standard nomination list. It was made by someone who got a slot through a back channel because one person thought to ask. She paused. We should build a front channel. Cross was quiet for a moment. Who decides what the front channel looks like, he said. We do, she said. In this room, over the next 6 months. He looked at her. Including me? If you want to be included. Another silence. The kind that rooms hold when something is being decided rather than discussed. Yes, Cross said. I want to be included. Garrett looked between them with the expression of a man who has been briefed on the history and is watching it resolve in real time. All right, Garrett said, let's talk about what the front channel looks like. The first cohort of the Environmental Cognition Assessment Program ran 11 months after the JPMA. 8 candidates, drawn from 4 branches. From billets ranging from a SEAL sniper with 12 years in Nice-Vaz to a 24-year-old Army signals specialist from a conventional unit who had been nominated by a warrant officer who'd watched her navigate a communications blackout in a jungle environment by reading weather patterns that no one else in the element had noticed. Mara ran the first week herself, not as an instructor standing at the front of a classroom delivering material. As an observer, sitting in the back of every session, watching the candidates interact with the environment problems she'd designed, taking notes in the same battered notebook that had been on the firing bench at Raven Rock. She was looking for the thing that she couldn't teach, the thing that was already there, waiting for someone to point it out. In 3 of the 8 candidates, she found clear evidence of it within the first 2 days. In 2 others, she found something that wasn't the same thing but was adjacent, a related capacity that the program hadn't been designed for, but that she made a note about. In the remaining 3, she found solid technical competence, good observational discipline, the kind of professional excellence that the existing training infrastructure was very good at producing. All of it was useful. Not all of it was what she was looking for. On the fourth day, during a terrain observation exercise in a forested section of the facility's evaluation range, she watched the signals specialist. Her name was Patel, Candidate Patel in program terminology, small and quiet in a way that reminded Mara of something she didn't fully examine. Stand at the edge of a tree line for 7 minutes without moving, watching a stretch of mixed terrain that the exercise asked her to evaluate for approach routes and concealment positions. 7 minutes was longer than any other candidate had stood before moving. When Patel finally produced her evaluation, she had correctly identified all 4 designated positions and had annotated her assessment with observations about the micro-weather patterns in the tree line that nobody had asked for and that were, in Mara's assessment, accurate. Mara found her during the afternoon break. "The weather annotations," Mara said, "in your terrain evaluation." Patel looked at her with the particular wariness of a junior candidate being approached by program leadership. Was that outside the scope of the assessment?" "It was outside the assessment criteria. It was not outside the scope." Mara looked at her. "How long have you been doing that?" "Doing what?" "Reading micro-weather, connecting atmospheric patterns to terrain features." Patel was quiet for a moment. "Since I was a kid," she said finally. "Growing up in the Gujarat coast, my grandfather was a fisherman. He couldn't afford instruments. He taught me to read the water and the sky and the land together." She paused. "I didn't think it was relevant to the assessment." "It's the most relevant thing you've shown me in 4 days," Mara said. Patel looked at her. "Keep annotating," Mara said. "Everything you notice. Don't filter it for relevance. Let me see everything that comes through." She walked away before Patel could respond, because the response wasn't the point. The point was the instruction, and Patel would either follow it or she wouldn't, and if she followed it, Mara would see what was behind the filter. That evening, she wrote in her notebook for 2 hours. Not assessment notes, not curriculum documentation. Something more like a letter that wasn't addressed to anyone, in the style of someone working something out on paper, because the alternative was working it out in her head, which was slower and less honest. What she wrote was this: "The program works when it finds what is already there. The program fails when it tries to install what isn't. The job is not to create capacity. The job is to remove whatever is blocking the capacity from operating." She crossed out the capacity. She wrote the person. What? Hale came to the facility on the program's final evaluation day. He sat in the back of the observation room during the culminating assessment, a complex multi-environment problem that ran for 4 hours and required candidates to demonstrate environmental reading capacity across terrain types, weather conditions, and time pressures that varied systematically across the sequence. It was the most demanding evaluation design Mara had produced, and it was imperfect. She had identified 6 things she would change for the next cohort, and it was also substantially more sophisticated than anything the existing assessment literature had produced for this capability domain. Cross had contributed to the evaluation design. That was still a fact that Mara occasionally had to remind herself of, not because it was unwelcome, but because it hadn't been predictable. He'd come into the curriculum working group 3 months in with a specific proposal about the time pressure variables, rooted in his rapid engagement expertise, translated into terms the environmental cognition framework could use, and the proposal had been good. She'd told him so. He'd been gruff about the acknowledgement, which she had by then learned was not hostility, but a form of discomfort with the situation that he was managing as best he could. They worked around each other in the way of people who have found a functional dynamic and are not going to press it further than function requires. It wasn't friendship. It was something more durable than the version of collegiality that looked like friendship. It was mutual recognition, the acknowledgement that the other person was operating in good faith toward a goal they both cared about, and that the frictions between them were worth tolerating because the work was worth doing. That was enough, more than enough, honestly. Hale watched the evaluation from the back of the room, quiet, making occasional notes. When the 4 hours were done and the candidates had finished and the evaluation team was reviewing scores, he came to stand beside Mara at the observation window. "Patel," he said. "Top of the cohort," she said. "By how much?" "Not close." She looked through the glass at Patel, who was sitting with the other candidates in the debrief space, drinking water, looking at her own assessment notes. She annotated everything, every session, every environment, 17 pages of environmental observations across 4 days that nobody asked for, The depth of the pattern recognition is... She stopped. It's better than mine was at her age. Hale looked at her. I'm not being modest, she said. I'm being accurate. She grew up reading coastal environments with someone who was doing it at a level most instruments can't replicate. She has a 20-year baseline of observation in a complex dynamic system. What she needs is the framework to apply it in operational contexts. We can give her that. What does she do after the program? That's the next problem, Mara said. We've built the assessment. We haven't built the career pathway. Someone with this capability needs a billet structure that actually uses it. Right now, there's no MOS, no rating, no career identifier that captures what she is. That's a systems problem. Yes. She looked through the glass. Garrett said he'd work on it. Cross is He's apparently been in conversations with the Army's Career Management Office about a specialty identifier for the capability domain. Hale was quiet for a moment. Cross is building the career pathway. Cross is building the career pathway, she confirmed, with the flat, accurate delivery of someone reporting a fact that still occasionally surprised her. People change when the evidence changes, he said. Some people, she said, when the evidence is sufficient. She looked at Patel one more time and then looked away from the window. I'm going back to Nevada in 2 weeks, she said. Hale looked at her. Voss wants a second assessment run. Different conditions, different season. I want to use it to test the curriculum modifications before the second cohort starts. She paused. And I want to go back to the range itself. The North Range. The 4,200-meter line. She said it without weight, just the name of a place. I want to see it in a different season, different atmospheric conditions. I want to know whether the approach holds when everything about the environment is different. You want to see if you can do it again? I want to understand the first time better, she said. I made the shot. I know why it worked. But knowing why something worked once isn't the same as understanding the underlying principle well enough to teach it. She looked at him. I need to go back and fail a few times, in different conditions, so I know where the limits are. Hale absorbed this. It was so completely characteristic. The willingness to go back to the thing that had worked and deliberately test it against conditions it might not survive. Not because she was masochistic, but because she understood that one's success was a data point, not a principle, and she was building something that needed to be a principle. I'll come, he said. I didn't ask. I know. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back through the observation window at the candidates filing out of the debrief space, moving into whatever came next. The thing that I keep coming back to, she said, is that none of this was designed. The JPMA slot, the shot, the program review, Cross, Voss's offer. None of it was a plan. It was a series of things that happened, and the outcome depended on every piece of it landing a certain way. That's how most things work, Hale said. It's a fragile basis for something that's supposed to be institutional. So you make it less fragile. That's what the next cohort is for, and the one after that? He looked at her. You spent 3 years being the only person who could do what you do. You're building toward a world where that's not true anymore, where there are 20 people, 50 people who have the framework and the discipline by not your gift exactly, but their own version of it, in their own environments. He paused. That's the difference between a result and a change. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the observation room, the facility moved through its afternoon rhythms. Doors opening and closing, voices in corridors, the background operational hum of a place with a purpose. Normal institutional sounds. The sounds of work continuing. The candidate from the signals unit, Mara said finally. Patel. Yes. When I told her to keep annotating, to not filter for relevance, she looked at the now empty debrief space through the glass. She looked at me like I'd said something she'd been waiting to hear her whole career. She paused. I had the same expression, apparently, when you first told me the program was real, that there was a name for it. Hale told me I looked like I'd been handed a flashlight in a room I'd been navigating by feel for 10 years, he said. She turned to look at him. Did he say that? No, Hale said. I just made that up. But it seemed accurate. She almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that it changed the quality of her face entirely for a moment, made her look younger, less armored, the version of herself that existed before she'd learned to hold the armor as a default. It's accurate, she said. The steel target, at the 4,200-meter line at Raven Rock Desert Range was replaced with a fresh one 6 weeks after the JPMA assessment because the original had been struck and the program's documentation protocols required a clean target for subsequent assessments. The original steel plate was not discarded. It went into the range facility's small, informal archive, a locked cabinet in the back of the briefing room that held objects the range cadre had collectively decided were worth keeping. A bent rifle barrel from a barrel failure in 2019 that had injured nobody and remained technically unexplained. A rangefinder that had given an impossible reading during a night exercise 3 years ago that turned out to be correct. Small objects that marked moments where something had happened that the standard documentation couldn't fully contain. The plate from the 4,200-meter line had a single hole in it, off-center from the aim point but solidly within the scoring zone, made by a round that had traveled through 3 distinct wind environments, compensating for thermal distortion, a venturi acceleration through a rock formation, and a terminal updraft off a south-facing canyon wall, all of it calculated not through instruments and ballistic tables, but through the unnameable discipline of a person who had learned, somewhere between a coastal Indian household and a classified operation in the Lashkar Valley, and 7 years of working in environments that didn't have a category for her, to stop filtering out what the world was trying to say. The plate went into the cabinet, the program went forward, and Patel, warrant officer. Patel, 18 months later, after a career identifier had been created and she'd been the first person promoted under it, would stand in front of her own first cohort of candidates at a facility in the Pacific Northwest and tell them, at the start of the first session, the same thing Mara had told her. Don't filter for relevance. Let me see everything that comes through. She would say it in her own voice, with her own history behind it, and some of the candidates would write it down, and some would just nod, and one, a Marine sergeant from a reconnaissance battalion who had grown up in the mountains of eastern Montana reading elk trails in winter weather with his father, would have the expression that Patel recognized because she had worn it herself. The expression of someone who has been handed a language for something they've been living in silence. The work is never finished, and it is never clean, and most of the people who matter most are the ones nobody thought to ask. The shot is proof of nothing except what you let yourself see, and what you allow yourself to hear in the spaces where the noise goes quiet and the world is simply, honestly telling you the truth.